which I imagine that all these artists have access to on some level. It's kind of timeless. Okay? I don't know if that makes it relevant. I mean, it's human. It's like poetry, or it's like literature, or anything else. I mean, you can look at it and say it's very retrograde. Looking at it, you could say it's kind of archaic, or it's nostalgic. But I think it's, is poetry nostalgic? I mean, do people talk about jazz music and say it's nostalgic? You have different kinds of music forms, different kinds of art forms. I think it's relevant. I think they're expressions of the human spirit.
Anyone else want to speak to that question?
Well, it's funny because I really love We Talk, You Listen by Brandow Jr., and I love how he talks about in the 1960s, so it's like over 50 years ago, that they were in this image-saturated society, right? And that people wanted experience. But it's interesting that paintings are images, but they're also experiences. The fact that so much in our society is mass-produced, which is awesome, I'm not against that. But you look at a painting, every single thing, even if it's a splatter, it's a deliberate splatter, like there was emotion that went into it. So it's amazing that just every single thing was deliberate in one way or form. And then also, in our society, so much changes, and we see so many images, but they're in, out, quick, Every time I watch a movie, I get depressed, I'm like, God, I'm a painter, I should be making movies. But then I'll forget about it 2 weeks later, ADD. So paintings are kind of touchstones, because I'll think about 2 paintings I grew up with. Ruthie Blaylock Jones, there's a funeral scene, and it's a veteran in the winter. And I grew up with that painting, and I have seen that painting for a really long time, I'm old. And every time I go to a funeral, I'll think about that painting. And another painting is Bert Seaborn. It's 2 people on the Trail of Tears, and it's a little person. I guess that goes back to your seeing the invisible, seeing the unseen world. A little person has tied a rabbit to these old people on the Trail of Tears. And that just made the Trail of Tears real to me, because that was before photography, and it made little people real to me. So I think the fact that you live with a painting day in, day out, it just bores yourself into your soul in a way that maybe other media don't.
Wow. Heidi, do you want to answer?
I'm good.
Okay. Ehren, you want to?
I actually, part of me asked that question myself, is what I'm doing relevant? I know we're supposed to be defending that, but I think Mateo said it really well, that it's a very human thing. I don't know. I think a lot about, am I just really just taking up space with my paintings? Is this just going to be something that's buried in the ground 100 years from now that is a pollutant? Acrylic is plastic, basically. So I ask that question of myself a lot, and I think the older and more mature I get, I realize that that I'd like to try something that is much more sustainable. But I didn't ask to be brought into aerosol paint, which is a pollutant to not only the can is a combustible can, so you can't recycle it, but also the fumes that it emits is toxic fumes. So I asked that question actually myself a lot, and all I can think of really is that it's a good sign of the times, where we are at as humans and what's important to us, and how are we how do we care about the world in relation to caring about our own self, getting that self-gratitude out of painting. So.
Just to kind of piggyback off of that, I think what he brings up is really valid as far as questioning the relevance of painting in your own personal practice. And I think one of the questions that comes up for me, and I think maybe what he's alluding to is like painting as a practice that's validated through an audience. And I don't believe that that's necessarily like the goal in my personal practice. I think if we're going to talk about the relevance of making art and making painting for myself, I think it's enough if it's a tool that allows you to sort of like deconstruct or understand your own life experiences in hopes of perhaps like becoming or doing better for yourself, which in turn could ultimately like do better for the community or your family, whatever it is. then that's all you can really ask for. So in that context, I would say that there is that relevance of it, of like, I don't know, I don't want to sound too like self-help book-ish, but there's that element to it, and I guess in that consideration, that's what would make it relevant for me.
Yeah, great, absolutely, I agree. I always think about painting in terms of identity and really being able to physically translate your identity, personal and artistic, onto the page, onto the canvas. And I know that a lot of people think in that way, whereas maybe photographers would say, you know, my vehicle of art, my mechanical apparatus, that translates my identity onto, you know, onto the work I produce. So I guess I'd love to hear from all of you about your identity and how you feel it is translated physically, or maybe Mateo, you want to talk about how your identity, or your personal artistic identity, could be translated through both photography and painting.
It's an interesting question. It's the kind of underpinnings of the question. Okay, so when I was in grad school, we studied photography. I wasn't really a good grad student. I'd spend much time. People said I was a drive-through grad student. Just kind of showed up for a critique and left. But I did, you know, I paid some attention. So, you know, one of the underpinnings of this idea is that there's a discourse on aura, right? So aura has to do with sort of authenticity and mana, energy, originality. And, you know, so when photography is introduced, part of it is this idea, you know, some artists, traditional painters, easel painters, who use just color, you know, they use just pure form to express themselves. They argue that photography doesn't have aura. It's not an original thing. You didn't generate it. Current discourses, if you look at someone like David Solly, for instance, he uses a lot of photographic imagery projected onto a canvas, and he draws on it, and then he paints it later. So he uses photographs and projectors, opaque projectors, but it's also hand-built. You know, and one of his arguments is that prior to, you know, relatively recently, every object that was generated, every painting and drawing that was made was non-photographic. It was all made by conscious decision. Artists used their hands, their eyes, their kind of cognition, you know, their aura, if you will, to generate work. And then now there's a kind of crisis, maybe, this kind of perception of intellectual crisis, because people feel, you know, there's now imagery. If you look at, like, you know, Warhol or Lichtenstein or Rauschenberg, not Lichtenstein, but Rauschenberg, you know, if you look at pop, if you look at photographic pop imagery, you know, part of this argument is now that there is kind of figure-ground relationships and these kind of paintings which emerge, which have nothing to do with the cognition. They're just generated by photographs, printing machines, computers now. So it's pretty dense stuff. It's interesting stuff. You know, it goes back to the idea of the cave painting again. It goes back to this idea of, you know, authenticity and originality in the hand of the artist. I don't really, I study it. I'm somewhat aware of it. I don't look at it as being a crisis. I just, you know, I like using photographs. I like painting on them. I like painting without them. I just like to paint, really. I mean, that's just the essence of it. I just enjoy the act. As goes back to what Heidi was saying. I mean, I don't know how many people are artists in the audience, but if you're engaged in painting in your life, or drawing, or whatever your pursuit is, making pottery, it could be anything, there can be some very beautiful things that come out of that. You know, just your life can be more fulfilled. It can fill you and kind of make you more resonant or happier in your life. So I guess ultimately, you know, I think it's interesting to be aware of, you know, kind of discourse and what people talk about, but I'm also, you know, fundamentally speaking, I'm less concerned with discourse. I'm more just concerned with making stuff. I just like to make stuff with my hands. I like to make things, and I like to show things to people and see what their response is. And you know, I was in grad school again, and I was talking to an instructor, and I was like, you know, what's the point of all this? Does it, you know, I mean, you want to do it, so you do it, you study it, and you get out of the program, you go on, you make images. And I was saying to, you know, this instructor, this is at UNM, and I said, you know, is there a place for me when I leave here? You know, how will I know what my place is in the world when I leave this program? There's no longer going to be instructors talking to me about my work. I won't have crits. There's no midterm. There's no final. You wind up in a studio. You leave the program and you get a studio. If you're struggling artist, you work in a garage somewhere. If you make a little bit of cash, or if your significant other, your partner has money, they rent you a little studio and take care of you. And, but what's your place and what's your Tao? And he said to me, hey, if you really enjoy doing this, and if you're good enough at it, there'll always be a place for that. There'll always be people that are interested in collecting the work and supporting you and engaging in you with what you're doing, your discourse and your journey. And they become part of that journey, really, in a sense. But he did say, it can't just be some kind of unskilled attempt. It has to be something that you have to be good at it. You have to be earnest. You have to be well-trained at it. And he said, if you have that, if you're lucky, if you have all those things and some luck, that there will be people that will respond to it.
Great, thank you. I like thinking about the combination of media that you're talking about and that kind of discourse, and thinking about Warhol, or thinking about Wolfgang Tillmans or Carl Walker, these artists who really take different media, at really new media, and combine it with painting and see what happens. And to that effect, Heidi, I know you work in printmaking as well, so I'd love to hear about your combination of printmaking and painting, and how that informs your practice and your artistic identity.
Well, I think that's maybe what I was alluding to in the beginning, is that I don't feel, to a certain extent, I don't know that I can sit up here and defend painting as if it's something that belongs solely to me, and this is just 100% of my artistic practice. But and I feel that printmaking just allowed me to, and all the other mediums really, allow me to sort of engage in all these other or questions or ideas that I have that aren't well articulated just through one medium. And that's always a constant battle that I have with myself and the things that I'm making, is that I feel very restricted almost, and I think it's easy to get caught up in that. And I'm speaking for myself, living in this town. I think on one hand it is very, we're in one of the largest art markets in the country, and but we have a very limited amount of mediums that we're exposed to or that people can display. And so for someone that's, not 100% one way or the other, it's kind of a tricky thing to sort of, for me to float around or navigate. So that is why I use printmaking and painting, and I had dabbled in studying design for a while and some other mediums, but only because of that, because I don't want to feel restricted in expressing or discovering all these elements of questions that I'm curious about, or perhaps even discovering new things about my identity.
Absolutely. Does anyone else want to talk about identity within their work? Monica or Ehren? You don't have to. It's all right. Great. These are really, really insightful answers. Thank you all. I guess going off of what you were saying, Heidi, that painting or any one medium can be very restricting. So going back to the title of this panel, even just thinking about Baudelaire's opinion that only painting can do this, only painting can express what is invisible, what is intangible, what is imaginary, what we feel but perhaps can't say. I guess I would love to hear what you think about that, and if you agree with Heidi that maybe it's good to explore other methods, or if perhaps you believe in that but you find yourself drawn back to painting, just regardless. So, would anyone like to begin?
Maybe we should start defending new media.
Sure.
Because really that's under attack in this town. You could argue that sound art not only expresses the invisible, it stays invisible. It never becomes visible, so you're awesome. And you're creating something, and through performance art, you're taking someone out of their normal life they're experiencing something that can never be repeated. So there's a lot to be said for that. I don't know.
Absolutely.
And actually, it is funny because with the NSA, we're thinking about surveillance and we're more and more surveyed. And most of the photographs in our lives are not even made by humans, but people mine that for art. And really, okay, that's not mark making, but the other aspect of art making is framing. So you're taking some section of society or something and framing it. Like John Cage when he had, I'm going to be a retard, is it 533? But it's just framing that time period and listening to the incidental sounds during that time period. So that's another valid art expression, is just framing. But anyway.
Well, if we're gonna,
I want
sorry.
to see something. I feel like Baudelaire was probably like super passionate about painting, but his mind kind of stopped, you know, and also probably was, you know, they didn't have the technological access that we have now, whereas we're looking at in the next, you know, 30 years having nanotechnology the size of a red blood cell. So my kind of look on where art is going is that, you know, we like going back to photography, it's almost like a symbiotic relationship where it's going to be more and more of that. So we're going to, you know, we're going to be like Terminator, you know, like cyborgs. And I really feel like it's going to create something so far beyond our comprehension, you know. Even like, you just look at like Guitar Hero, you know, like I can shred on Guitar Hero.